Elspeth, Magistrix of the Amethyst Order, and unrelenting protector of Nuln, the Empire, and mankind. She is shunned, distrusted, even feared by the common folk, but in today's saga, she is all that stands between the Empire and certain doom. The forces of chaos muster, and the end times draw near. Morskans, beastmen, Skaven, marauders, undead, even a few despicable elves, all seek to undo the Empire. Karl Franz musters the Elector Counts and plays politics, while Elspeth does the dirty work. This is a story of faith, steel, and an ungodly amount of gunpowder. Here is my narrative campaign for Elspeth von Draken, the Dark Lady of Nuln. Our story begins, unsurprisingly, in Nuln, the beating industrial heart of the Empire. Reports had been coming in about the dead rising from barrows near the local villages, and the city's grim protector was mustered from her tower and sent to deal with them. Elspeth does not hide her powers nor downplay her true nature. She is a master of death, and the winds of Shaiish, the ominous magical force of the dead, billowed around her. You might think this sudden rise in undead activity might be something to do with her. Any who connected those dots and voiced their concerns in Nuln quickly changed their minds. After a visit from the city's secret police, Elspeth marched to meet the dead. The worry of a few zombies wandering around had been vastly understated, and it turns out the undead had taken hold of the castled city of Feldorf. What they needed such a city for is unknown, but the skeletons, zombies, ghouls, and other pests of the grave were hell-bent on defending their usurped home. As Elspeth's troops neared, they noticed the walls were being manned by zombies. What they intended to do from up there was, again, unknown, but they made great targets for the Imperial rocket teams. As the walls were buffeted by an explosive onslaught, a ram rumbled closer to the gates, and the newest regiment of pistoliers sped towards the walls to harass the defending dead. After a few solid minutes of blasting and hitting, not very much at all, they withdrew and came up with a plan B. What they had achieved, however, was in making an ungodly amount of noise with all their shooting and missing, distracting the dead long enough for the ram to reach the gate and batter down the door. The pistoliers, seemingly slighted that their heroic assault of the walls had flopped, stormed through the gates intent on taking the upper reaches of the city. Though their heroic charge was met by a mob of rusty spears and brainless zombies, which brought many of the horsemen down. Their sacrifice, while unnecessary, was not entirely in vain. The blunder allowed the rest of the forces to take the courtyard. Handgunners and Nuln Ironsides clambered up to the walls, kicking aside decaying corpses and raining bullets down on the risen dead below. Their commander, a vampire who is not important enough to name, was in the thick of the fight, but he could do nothing to stop the onslaught of steel and gunpowder. He crumbled to dust, and his army followed soon after. Having dealt with the threat to her lands, Elspeth was soon faced by another of the Empire's immortal enemies. Some rampaging greenskins were running amok across her lands, smashing up villages and doing horrible things to the livestock. These lots were savage orcs, and they made your standard issue orc look like a graduate from Altdorf College. They'd seen how their civilized cousins used shields to block bullets, so they imitated and did the same, only they hadn't invented shields yet. Some were so idiotic that they did not obey the laws of physics, floating around in the sky after death. Given their proximity to the Walking Dead on the intelligence scale, Elspeth and her generals knew that they could bait the orcs and batter them with overwhelming firepower. Yet the true ferocity and eagerness of their enemy had been misunderstood. The invaders took heavy losses as the Imperial guns battered them, sending bits of charred orc over the hills like morbid confetti. But for every one that turned into a grim red mist, a dozen more charged through. They smashed against the unprepared spearmen, and their rage and revelry for slaughter decimated Elspeth's lines. The artillery positions were swarmed, and without the firepower of the cannons, there was little hope against the tide of idiotic green anger. Retaking the firing positions was paramount, and the brave Imperial sons fought tooth and nail to reclaim the space and push the orcs back. With timing a little on the late side, reinforcements arrived to ease the pressure on the front lines. And when the artillery positions were freed of orcish interference, they returned to raining destruction down on the vulgar brutes. The greenskin menace was mounting, however, but after dealing with the orcs, handling a gaggle of black venom goblins seemed a walk in the park, though once again, reports of their numbers had been wildly understated. While their foes numbered in the thousands, forces of Nuln hatched an ingenious plan. They positioned themselves with a lake between them and the invaders. Well, calling it a lake is generous. A large puddle. It would come up to about your waist at its deepest point. But that's enough to drown a goblin. To prevent a watery death, the gobos had to skirt around its edges, resulting in large swathes of goblin congestion, masses of horrible green bodies clambering over each other, biting and prodding each other in their excitement. Easy targets for the gunners and cannoneers. One rocket crew claims they got 1,000 of them, though the dubious claim is disputed, and a little irrelevant given how easy the little buggers are to kill. The battle brought with it a sense of peace to Wissenland and Nuln. Their immediate enemies were dispatched. Their neighbouring province of Aveland had struck a mutually beneficial trade agreement, and the Emperor Karl Franz had taken notice of the actions on his southern borders. While the Dark Lady of Nuln and His Imperial Majesty don't exactly see eye to eye on most things, they share a common goal: to see the Empire protected. They just disagree on the how, but they would have to address these semantics, as a grave threat was already worming its way through Imperial lands. The lands of the dead were clawing their way from the Forsaken provinces. Vlad von Karstein, immortal vampire lord of Sylvania, was making dangerous moves, and was reigniting his mad old theory that he should be the true emperor of man. The longer they turned a blind eye, the more devastating his campaign would be. So Elspeth struck out, though not directly, because Vlad was really quite strong. No, she instead attacked the nearby undefended town of Flensburg in an act that she claims was strategic, not cowardly. The move drew the vampire Count ire, and he brought his forces forth. In the dead of night, under the sickly green glow of the Chaos Moon Morsleep, its presence should have been an omen for what's to come. Elspeth's forces took a defensive position, with outriders riding forth to harass the dead as they advanced. They focused on the bestial vanguard of the vampire, the various bats and bat-like creatures that vampires always seem enamored with. Vlad's Blood Knights gave chase, though they were met with cannon and rocket fire. It all seemed to be going like clockwork. The dead advanced, constantly under a hail of bullets and battered with explosives. Vlad's beloved wife Isabella was attacking the flanks, but the line was holding firm. She circled around to try and take out the cannon positions, a decision that proved fatal for her, as the gunners pivoted to strike her down and bring her low in an instant. This was the turning point, but not in Elspeth's favour. Seeing his beloved collapse in a haze of black powder, Vlad erupted into a blood rage that echoed across the battlefield. His rampage cut a violent swathe through the humans. The line started to crumble, and Elspeth and her generals barely managed to maintain order as a textbook skirmish turned into a tragic slaughter. Thousands of zombies returned to the earth are no solace for all the brave sons of the Empire lost at Flensburg. And an important lesson was learned that day. Do not underestimate Vlad von Karstein. And if you see the flickers of a blood rage overwhelm him, get away, far away. Preferably with a rifle in hand, or behind a counter. The dead lay quiet for a few nights after this, and the living were able to advance and wrest control of a few towns. The local villagers seemingly oblivious to the fact that they'd been working for and paying taxes to a bunch of zombies. Sylvanians, they're not the smartest. Elspeth's forces crept towards the castle city of Verdbad, and much to the dismay of her troops, she assaulted the city under cover of a violent storm, primarily for dramatic effect, though her rain-sodden soldiers did not appreciate her insistence on the correct atmosphere. Her cannons laid waste to the gates and tore vast breaches in the city walls. However, the stupidity of the local populace seemed to be infecting her own troops, as she ordered her rifles to cover the advance of her swordsmen. This was a confusing notion to them, and they just shot their mates in the back. Imbeciles. Elspeth was heard to mutter, and a new tactic was drawn up. Handgunners and outriders fired volleys through the shattered walls, and after a bloody skirmish, they wrested control of the courtyard and then the city from the undead. While the injured were being treated and bullets being pulled out of backs, the troops were descended on by a vast and terrible force. The mounted outriders brought word of disheartening numbers, wicked armoured knights and terrible machines that resonated dark energies. A collective sigh of relief was had when only bats emerged, but the storm that came next decimated the Imperial lines. The men were bracing for the slow advance of the shambling dead, but they were met with a lightning-fast assault that scattered their numbers. They gathered their discipline and held their positions, but the losses were grievous, and morale was falling to new lows. It wasn't just for the losses of life. Every man that fell was tragic, but it was felt twofold. As they would soon rise again and march on their former regiments, the psychological impact on the troops was astounding and deeply troubling. And despite it being explained to Elspeth as to why this might possibly be upsetting, she struggled to see why, nor share any hint of empathy for her troops and their emotions. It was an atrocious campaign, and the longer it dragged on, the worse it got. So it surprised everyone when messengers came from the vampire count pushing for peace. It was a hollow gesture, as he and Elspeth knew there would be no rest till one of them was dead. Well, deader than they currently were. As she pushed deeper into his lands, the undead forces became even more numerous. It was as though the forests themselves were alive. As the armies of Nuln marched forth, they were followed by constant shuffling of feet and creaking of bone, always just out of earshot. Vlad von Karstein knew the Empire. He knew what made them tick. He knew their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. He knew their fear of the dark. And that while he had plenty of monsters under his charge, the human's imagination would always invent more. He used this to his advantage. He kept his forces to the darkest places, ambushed from the trees. He attacked not to win, but to break spirits and erode confidence. Vampires are a resilient bunch, but Vlad's ability to take punishment was nothing short of legendary. He could charge, near on his own, and take the brunt of a dozen cannons and rocket batteries, face the fire of 100 handgunners and barely misstep. It would take the full magical force of Elspeth to finally stop him in his tracks, but only ever briefly. He'd fall one day, only to be spotted in the distance the following morning, always rallying more forsaken troops to his banner, preparing for his next assault, swinging his sword around like a deranged lunatic. The forces of Nuln gained a foothold in the Cursed Lands by taking Fort Oberstein, located between two very evil-looking mountains, a spot that almost gained a flicker of appreciation from the Graveyard Rose. She sent an engineer general with a silly name to push Svarthafen, while she moved her forces on Tempelhof. Winter was coming, and the snow was already laying thick on the ground, but Elspeth could not wait for better conditions. Every day that passed, new dead were being raised and added to the defensive force. She had to strike quickly. Lessons had been learned from the episodes of friendly fire previously, and no chances were being taken. The cannon batteries pounded the fortifications, while Hochland rifles brought down defenders from the walls. Gunners moved in on any breaches and shot anything that moved. Cannons repositioned. Infantry responded to the handgunner volleys, taking advantage of the devastation caused by swarming into the courtyard. From an embarrassing display of self-inflicted tragedy to a symphony of perfectly timed destruction, Elspeth watched her countrymen with something that almost resembled pride. She took to the courtyard herself, fighting fire with fire, or, in this case, the living dead with the power of death. Her potent magic turning flesh and bone to dust. Speed was the Wissenlanders' greatest ally in their invasion of Sylvania. But following in a close second were all of the other actual allies, the ones that had seen Elspeth's feats, conveniently ignored the minor war crimes and witchcraft, and showed their support. Dwarfs of the Black Mountains to the south and the World's Edge Mountains to the east roared their approval at her excessive destruction, and diplomatic agreements tied the fates of Wissenland, Averland, and the Reichland together. The time for petty border squabbling was over. The Empire will have no future while fractured. Elspeth's forces swept through Sylvania and tightened around Vlad's seat of power, the cursed city of the dead, Castle Drakenhof. As though a harbinger of doom, the unholy glow of the Chaos Moon Morsley bathed the city in a vile light, a precursor for the long and violent night Typical siege tactics would not work here. You can't starve out a city of skeletons, and a plan of attrition just gave the Count's necromancers more time to pull reinforcements out of the local graveyards. No. Elspeth would take a more direct approach, the Nuln approach. Batter the city with artillery until you're sure victory is certain, and then batter it some more. The memory of Vlad's blood fury had not left Elspeth, and she knew if she funneled her troops into the city, he would be there waiting, and he would inflict merciless carnage upon her assault force. As soon as she's in the city, she fights on his terms. She refused. Gunners were positioned at every opening in the wall, firing relentless volleys into the waiting dead. Walls were scaled and after fierce resistance captured, allowing rifle fire to rain down on the defenders. As soon as she controlled the pace of the battle, Elspeth swooped in and flexed her mastery of the dead. Vlad von Carsten, a scourge of the Empire for centuries, a seemingly perpetual thorn in the Empire's side. No more. Drakenhof was seized, and Vlad was given a death that not even he could recover from. How do you kill one who shrugs off rocket batteries like they're drops of rain? Well, I will leave that fate up to your imagination. As the last remaining necromancers of Sylvania were brought to justice, a power vacuum was formed. There was an empire of man and no undead maniac to terrorize us. This vacant position was filled almost as soon as Vlad's unholy remains were scattered, as Heinrich Kemmler brought his undead forces to bear, a shadowy figure that the Empire was convinced was already dead. That's the way with necromancers, though. Their deaths are often greatly exaggerated. Elspeth returned to Nuln, with the city's ruler Countess Emanuel planning celebrations for her great victory in Sylvania. But Elspeth was not here for parades, or balls, or politics. She came for guns. Big guns. And lots of them. The joint endeavour between the Nuln Gunnery School and the Amethyst College culminated in Elspeth's new Ironsides. The finest gunners in the city, packing potent firepower infused with the winds of Shaiish, the very power of death. There were some protests about the witchcraft and the vile death magic and calling it all an affront to Sigmar, but this noise quickly died out. The secret police may have been involved. While all were keen to unleash these new toys on endless waves of Walking Dead, en route to find trouble, trouble found them. Gotrek and Felix, adventurers of great renown and infamy, who had once upon a time saved Nuln from a Skaven invasion. Well, now they needed the favour repaid, as they'd once again found themselves in a sticky situation. And I mean sticky. They were trapped in Slanesh's realm of pleasure, and just how an entire army, as well as their horses, cannons, and giant dragons also got transported there, let's just say a wizard did it. The shots of the Imperial gunners tore through the scantily armoured demonettes like a million hot knives through butter. Their demonic leader, an exalted secret keeper, was also laid low with ease, and it appeared that the new armoury upgrades were more than enough for the job at hand. But the Dark Prince of Pleasure's forces kept coming. From portals poured winged furies, vile-tongued demons, and creatures even more foul. Elves. Yuck. A dwarfish cry of disgust roared across the battlefield from the Slayer, and a killing frenzy erupted. While their lack of clothes did make the debauched demons easy to kill, it also meant they could strike with eye-watering speed, resulting in several regiments being caught out and pounced upon. Cries of anguish morphed into fevered moans of pleasure as the demons did unspeakable things to their victims' minds, bodies, and souls. Once the dust had settled and the soldiers' composure regained, Gotrek and Felix pressed Elspeth about her intentions, and they joined forces with her faster than you can say endless hordes of undead. Well, Gotrek joined her, and wherever the Slayer goes to find his doom, his chronicler must follow. Besides, they knew the necromancer personally, and let's just say that they had scores to settle. The forces of Nuln felt confident despite the less than adequate weather that seemed to be following them. They just dispatched one of the greatest vampires the world had ever known. This new menace, he was a human, just some mad old coot in his dusty bones. With their upgraded firepower, any sea of bones he unleashed would shatter and crumble. They met his forces, bravado rampant in the lines. Cannon crews were making bets among themselves, and soldiers were lining up with a confident calmness. A detachment lay in wait in the forest, prepared to spring a trap and gun down the unexpecting undead. If they knew what was coming their way, they would have abandoned their posts and ran for their lives. For soon, the ground shook beneath the weight of thousands upon thousands of undead. The power of the necromancer keeping them alive was astounding, and they flooded forth and converged upon the living. Those soldiers in the forest were caught in a nightmare, overwhelmed and slaughtered by the monsters. Only a few survived, huddled around Godric and Felix as they held on desperately. The bulk of the Imperial forces fared no better, with the front line collapsing against the massive swell of bodies. Once the dam broke, the dead flooded over the artillery and mobbed the handgunners. Elspeth watched, with something that almost looked like horror as the dead kept coming. She dug deep and unleashed the winds of magic, but even her endless assaults of amethyst magic could not stem the tide. She rallied in the forest with the Slayer, and their defiant stand was apocalyptic. The remains of 1,000 necromantic monsters littered the undergrowth, creating a dense, tangled coverage of flesh and bone. But the undead never stopped. Kemler never stopped. The dead overpowered them. Elspeth managed to escape the carnage and found Felix a few days later, bruised and battered, but alive. The Slayer, however, was nowhere to be seen, and the two concluded that he must have fallen in the desperate struggle. It was a worthy doom, truly. And while free of his obligation, Felix stayed with Elspeth, intent on honoring his fallen companion by finding Heinrich Kemmler and punching him in the nose. The armies of Nuln were decimated. Recruiters took to the streets, but the defenders of the city knew a dark day was dawning, one that would get many shades darker still. From the bowels of the earth returns an old enemy of the city, the Skaven. Clan Mulder and their legions of abominations threatened the east, while the deranged warp engineers Clan Scryer were running rampant through Bretonnia. While some semblance of order was spreading across the south, the north of the Empire was in peril. Undead, Skaven, Norscan raiders, and the forces of the plague god Nurgle. But oh, look at that. Godric didn't die after all. Good for him, and what a tragedy. The combined forces of evil threatened humanity from all sides, and there was only one person they could turn to in their darkest hour. And it was not the Emperor, though he was still doing his best. With fresh forces in tow, Elspeth met the legions of dead once more, but she was not taking any chances. She took a defensive position and baited any stray dead that she could. Bit by bit, they picked apart the necromancer's forces, but then he turned his full focus on them. And from the trees they came, thousands upon thousands of unholy monsters. It seemed history was repeating itself, and despite her preparations, it wasn't enough. She doomed another army. Hundreds of the Empire's finest would soon be reanimated to wreak havoc upon the lands they once defended. No, she would not have that at all. As her men fought and died, she decided enough and took fate into her own hands. Kemmler was strong, but the power of death was only hers to control, and she would turn his greatest ally against him. Wherever the purple light of her spell shone, rot, decay, and horror followed. The necromancer kept calling forth his legions of the damned, and she kept turning them to dust. She transfixed her ire on him, and fueled by the raging whirlpool of souls that swarmed the battlefield, she channeled the raw power of death that swept across the landscape and obliterated the necromancer. Her army was gone. On that battlefield there were two who had denied death time and again, and they fought side by side, alone against insurmountable numbers. The Slayer did not trust her one bit, and she thought him an oaf. But neither could ask for a better companion to sow destruction with. They stood, defiant, until the dead finally stopped. What remained of her forces watched on, awestruck and horrified. But when she commanded it time to move out and meet the encroaching Skaven menace, none would dare defy her. They wrested control of Helmgart Fort, an ancient bastion built into Axebite Pass, constructed to halt the Empire's enemies. enemies that were on the move. Gunners were posted along every wall. Cannons and mortars held the back streets to pummel the encroaching force. In the dead of night, the Ratmen came. If the fort fell, the Skaven had a gateway into the Empire, and their next target would almost certainly be Altdorf. Elspeth could not let that happen. The vermin swarmed towards them as cannon crews loaded and fired. Ordnance ripped bloody trenches through the Ratmen ranks. They rushed ever onwards with bizarre machinery in tow with them, and... oh, Sigmar's balls, what in the hells was that? So the Skaven had weapons of mass destruction. This was fine, Elspeth thought. Everything is going to be fine. Despite having a 10-ton warpstone bomb dropped on them, the Imperial forces were holding the fort and their composure. And the Skaven were rattled by this. But as the men rallied and celebrated, 1,000 jaws collectively dropped as they saw thousands more gnashing furry devils surging towards the fort. Your average Skaven is typically quite deranged. A lunatic, sadistic, treacherous, fiendish, callous, disgusting, heretical, unstable, etc., etc. This barely begins to scratch the surface of Clan Scryer's chief warlock engineer, Ikit Claw. He's the kind to strap 100 tanks of flammable warp fire to the backs of 100 Ratmen and send them to attack a fort filled with cannons. Or the kind to drop a massive bomb for no clear tactical advantage simply because he could. He threw everything at that fort. And despite a grim outlook at first, the Imperial soldiers rallied behind Elspeth and drove the Skaven back in a bloody stand that shook the Imperial forces. Victory, but a hollow one. No one was under any illusions. The Skaven had not been defeated here. This was just the beginning of their troubles. They'd been stopped, barely, but at least Elspeth knew where they were. That was something more comforting than the reports of Clan Moldor to the east. There was no sign of them, no sightings, no armies, no attacks. Just one terrifying observation. Kislev was no more. It had been wiped off the map, her city scorched, blackened husks, and a constant faint echo of rats, somewhere far off. The undead had been pushed back, but they were gathering numbers, and in the northern provinces the forces of Nurgle were still spreading. Beastmen had started patrolling through the ravaged forests, and the only solace in all of this was that there'd been no word of any greenskins, because the Slayer King Ungrim Ironfist had killed them all.
Manlings, are you ready to slaughter
And Nuln declared
enemy?
the Lord of Karak Kadrin an ally. All around her, enemies were gathering strength and hasty alliances were formed. For the next few weeks, settlements were traded back and forth, diplomatic agreements were drawn up, and the elves kept coming with bargains and treaties, but were told to get lost. Small skirmishes were erupting across the eastern front, and the Imperial forces even managed to root up the Skaven from their underground tunnels. A secondary force pushed into Bretonnia, hoping to stem the vermin, though it became clear, after a few disastrous encounters, that the Ratmen, while disorganized and cowardly, were also in possession of a lot of guns, and most of them worked. On top of this mountain of woe, from across the seas came Be'lakor, a demon prince who'd been a blight on this world for millennia. He was now sailing across the sea, determined to take advantage of the Skaven and undead-induced hysteria. It may sound like I'm not giving this threat the gravity it deserves, and that's because Be'lakor was absolutely rubbish. He landed on the beaches and surged forth, only to be blasted to smithereens by cannons and gunfire. His Chaos followers, a bit at a loss of what to do next, committed to an unenthusiastic charge and were nearly all killed. It's for the best. There didn't need to be another actor in the story of Bretonnia's turmoil, and it was reaching a nice natural transition. The undead threat that brought Bretonnia to the brink of annihilation was being undone, and Kemler's forces were scattered to the corners of the kingdom, although the threat of Clan Scryer was ever present. But the Bretonnians would have to fend for themselves, as Elspeth's gaze turned westward to meet the rising threat of Clan Moldor. She recruited a few regiments of dwarfish ironbreakers, courtesy of her blossoming relationship with the Slayer King, and marched on the kingdom formerly known as Kislev. Her absence was felt immediately, as Axbite Pass, site of the heroic Imperial resistance just a few weeks prior, had fallen. The borders were buckling and about to break. Altdorf would be next, but they would have to hold. Elspeth's forces were split, and somewhere along the way the inseparable duo of Gottrick and Felix had been separated, finding themselves on different ends of the Empire. In more positive tidings, however, north of the Reich, a land that for weeks had been a desolate, plagued, violent hellscape, was slowly being returned back to civilization. Festus, champion of Nurgle, had been pottering around for a while, being a minor inconvenience. But Wissenland forces finally caught up with him. His disgusting followers were torn apart by artillery fire, and Festus was condemned to death by firing squad. The North was mere days away from calling itself civilized once more, when it was set upon by a horde of Norscan raiders.
You are a nuisance.
The Imperial armies let out a very long, very exhausted sigh, turned around, and went to fight this new threat. Seemed they were destined to never escape this wretched North. While Nuln was putting out fires around the Empire, Elspeth was playing the diplomatic game. Well, not her personally, she hated people, but the Countess Emmanuel had a few chosen sweet talkers who continued to strengthen relationships with the Emperor, as well as to reignite the ancient alliance between man and dwarf. They even made friends with some ogres, and an agreement was made. They would defend the South from all the horrible stuff in the Badlands. In return, they'd get the opportunity to fight all the horrible stuff in the Badlands. Bretonnia was facing its darkest days yet, as Ikit's claw and his Skaven tide poured over the towns and cities, doing horrible things to this once green and noble land. Though distracted, the Empire had not forgotten their neighbours, and Gottrick's army moved to retake Helmgart's fort and secure the Empire's borders, though the mountain city was a lot more underground than any of the generals remembered it being. Not ideal for big, gangly humans, but perfect for a dwarf slayer who had the time of his life stampeding through the streets, carving red ruins through the racky rabble. It was a victory in hollow terms. In reality, they'd managed to get themselves back to where they were a few weeks ago, and Ikit Claw and his armies were not going to sit idly by. Thousands of the Warlock Engineers' subjects surged into Gottrick's army, still recovering from retaking Axbite Pass, sitting ducks to the twisted inventions the Skaven brought forth. As a dozen squabbling generals chittered and barked orders this way and that, the troops appeared to obey none of them and inflicted terrible suffering on whatever was closest. As the men scrambled to get away, they were picked off by Jezzail crews or caught in the rattling gunner storm. It's like there were a swarm of 1,000,000 vibrant green bugs. Except if you touched one, you died, because they were bullets. But the Skaven weren't the only ones showing off some new toys, as the Empire had brought some of Nuln's newest prototypes to the field, straight from the Royal College of Engineering. It was a bloodbath, utter, unprecedented carnage. Man and rat lay intermingled in the muck. This was not a good day for the Empire. Wasn't a good day for the Skaven either, but they didn't really care all that much. But the humans did. A lot of sons, fathers and brothers wouldn't be coming home. They gave their everything for the Empire, defiant in the face of an unhinged, reckless evil. The survivors paid their respects and carried forward. There was no time to rest nor reflect. Ikit Claw did not care for the thousands of rat men he'd committed to death. He was gathering forces once more and salivating over the destruction of the Empire. As was Throt the Unclean, as was Azazel, as was Bellicor. All were preparing for a reckoning. All were plotting the fall of civilization. The forge fires of Nuln never stopped. The end of the world was coming, and Elspeth was going to face it with faith, steel, and a hell of a lot of gunpowder. Kislev, the shield that protected the Empire, lay in ruin. Not only were her cities devastated, the corpse of this once fierce land was now riddled with parasites. As we've learned from today's dealings with Clan Skryre, the Skaven are a vile, irredeemable, disgusting, cowardly, terrible race that are an affront to all that is good and make me angry to waste my breath upon them. And then there's Clan Mulder. The very worst of the bunch. There's no such thing as enough to them. They ravaged Kislev with their unholy abominations, and now they marched on the Empire. They were a cancer, and the time for careful treatments was over. Karl Franz and the rest of the Empire, they can defend till the end of days, but that won't help. Elspeth took her warriors and marched towards the belly of the beast, determined to exorcise and expunge the tumor that had rooted itself in the rotting husk of the north. The assaults from Clan Skryre and the ecstatic legions were amassing. The Western Front was being held admirably by the engineer Captain Rickard Graber. Well, by him and Gotrek, who was there to kill Skaven en masse, as well as to stop the engineer falling to certain temptations. After weeks of Gotrek grumbling about how the Skaven would all be dead by now if this were the dwarves fighting, he noticed something. The Skaven were, well, they weren't anywhere. Their armies were in tatters. Gotrek was vindicated when he discovered why. Belagar Ironhammer. He and his armies had smashed through the Skaven and were sending the furry menace packing.
What brings you before the heir of Nuln?
What's more, they were closing in on Skaven Blight. If that accursed city fell, Clan Skryre, and maybe even the rest of Skaven society, would crumble. Ikit Claw did not seem to be taking this threat all too seriously, and he was gallivanting around northern Bretonnia, whether he knew or not. It seemed his final hurrah was close at hand. Finally, this land might know peace. Oh, don't worry about Be'lakor. He's been invading since, well, I guess since we last saw him in Act 2. He's made no progress. This is probably the furthest he's got. Elspeth ran into resistance as she encroached on the lands of Clan Moulder. Frost bit into skin, and as the Skaven neared, she let loose hell itself. Everywhere was smoke, scorched flesh, severed limbs. Skaven and man and dwarf mixed together in violent melee. The smell of singed fur and blood an undertone to the constant fog of black powder. The flash of rockets preceded the booms of devastation as the pride of Nuln rang across the valley. The Skaven never stood a chance. They died as they lived, fleeing like the vermin they were. News rang out of another unexpected threat. The Norskans had united under the king of the trolls, Throg, though this meant a break in the war. Except Elspeth didn't want to break. She opened negotiations to tell Throg that she is going to destroy him. Not the most stable of leaders, Throg gathered his armies of marauders and monsters and tracked down Elspeth. The menagerie of mutant beasts and crazed Northmen struck fear into the Imperial soldiers. The wind whipped at their ranks, specks of warpstone carried along by it, an indicator that they were now firmly on Clan Moulder land. The enemy advanced, led by ferocious wolfmen, and they tore towards the Wissenland ranks, frothing at the mouth. Elspeth's instructions were clear. Not one step back. As the beast approached, the iron sights locked and fired. The wolf was thrown back by a wall of iron as the volley came. A second sidestepped the monster and rushed past, raw ferocity pushing it through the hail of amethyst gunfire. It made it to the line before a close-range volley brought it low. Its dead eyes stared wide, uncomprehending. The rest of the Norskans advanced. The artillery fired, the riflemen fired, the rockets fired. Yesterday the Norskans were rubbing sticks together and amazed that they could make sparks out of nothing. Today, they were having Armageddon rain down upon them. They could barely comprehend artillery, let alone shells infused with the deadly winds of Shaiish. The fears of the Northmen swarming over the soldiers evaporated as they saw the brutes set alight, their war cries twisting into screams. Seeing the primitive idiots scramble around to hide from her gunners, wrestling with each other, desperate to survive the onslaught of death and destruction, it almost twisted Elspeth's perpetual scowl into a smile. Almost. As the din of battle died down and the smell of burning Norskan was carried away by the wind, Elspeth realized something. She'd been at war with Azazel and the armies of Slaanesh for weeks, yet she'd never seen him. The demon was sacking town after town, seemingly trying to goad the Graveyard Rose. Drag her along and keep her guessing. That's his way. He's a tease. It's not about the conquest. He yearns for the chase. Elspeth isn't like that. She doesn't play games. She ignored him and started destroying his capital city. Before Azazel could say, "No, not like that," Elspeth's gunners were raining fiery vengeance down on the Prince of Damnation's twisted abode, the aptly named Tower of Crack. While Slaanesh was erratic and moved like lightning, Elspeth was going to take her time and give his crack a pounding like none he'd ever received. The unholy city was battered relentlessly by a never-ending hail of shells. As marauders tried to find shelter in the streets, they realized there was no escape. She would not stop until this vile city was a dirty footnote in history. Like a well-oiled machine, the humans moved through the city, securing it street by street, artillery crews raining desolation on any entrenched soldiers. Demogryph knights bounded ahead, stopping any attempts to reposition and outflank. Though a counterattack never came, the followers of Slaanesh were all either dead, fleeing, or enjoying their last few moments on Earth together. It was a devastating blow against the forces of chaos. There were a few survivors, marauders who the Empire spared, and they had a simple message to take to Azazel. The details and absolute humiliation of their defeat. Elspeth had killed thousands, destroyed his sordid citadel, and she lost not a single man in doing so. The gloating turned an irate Azazel feral, leading to a destructive rampage. He attacked the defenseless city and burned it to the ground. Elspeth didn't care. They were Kislevites. They followed hot on the demon's trail, but he was skirting their forces. They figured they'd use that to his advantage and wrested one of his forts out from under him. But just like that, the trap had been sprung and the demon pounced. To the west, Godric and his manling companions had managed to track Ikitclaw down across the verdant fields of Bretonnia to the most beautiful picture-perfect vista they had ever seen. The only thing that could make it better, Godric mused, was a pile of 10,000 Ratmen corpses. The Slayer and company got to work. They let the Skaven come to them, making a stand at either side of a bridge and a ford. The Skaven were using their tried and tested tactic of numbers, but the engineers had calculated for that, setting up rocket batteries overlooking the narrow straits. As the accursed creatures flooded forward, they were met with the fiery rain of Nuln. It was pandemonium. Rats fled, trampled by the reinforcements spurred forward. Trapped between the violent threats of the lunatic Ikitclaw and the baleful gaze of the possibly even more unstable Godric Gurnison. It was a massacre, albeit a brief one. The Skaven converged on the Imperial forces but quickly changed their mind when they realized that all that awaits them was scary death. More turned tail and ran, bombarded as they fled, and Ikitclaw did what Ikitclaw does best. He exploded. But as the din of battle subsided in the west, the horns blared in the east as Azazel moved his forces to encircle the humans trapped in the beaten-down forts. The walls would provide no defense, the breaches could not be repaired, and the Slaaneshi demons would close the distance in seconds. All they had to do was get through the gaps and encircle the defenders inside, and their fates would be sealed. The defenders and the garrison were in a sorry state. Injured, exhausted, they could barely make a regiment between them. What scraps they had plugged the breaches, praying they could keep the demons out long enough for the gunners to do their work. This was the first time the Empire would be facing the Dreadlord Azazel, and they had heard such terrible, terrible things. As they saw his form approaching the city walls, their fears quickly evaporated when they all realized a crucial detail at the same time. The silly bugger was naked. He was just wearing silk. What a fool. Together as one, they lined up and fired, again and again, iron shot biting deep into his unholy flesh. His eyes grew wide as he realized that this was not a good plan. He managed to make it to the walls and inflict enough suffering to last the poor company a lifetime. But it didn't take long for his injuries to catch up to him, and he fell. While there were sighs of relief, the air grew thin once more as the charioteers and marauders raced towards the breaches, dodging and weaving past scattered cannon fire. But as the cry of their demon lord tore across the field, the onslaught faltered. Some turned back, others merely hesitated. the Lapps passed the upper hand over to the defenders, who sent outriders to take advantage of the confusion, gunning down isolated attackers and sending the remaining marauders packing. The defenders were dumbstruck. They had survived. Not just survived, they had defeated a demon lord of Slaanesh, though it had become increasingly obvious that the Prince of the Damned was not the tactical mastermind they'd been worried about. The soldiers were so motivated by all this that they didn't even think twice about being marched north, straight towards Hellpit. The twisted labyrinth of Sigmar knows what vile experiments and horrors. But it didn't matter, because they wouldn't have to get close. The soldiers had found their rhythm. That is, let the rockets do all the work, and then stroll in like a hero. The flurry of victories, one after another, filled the humans with hope. Just a few short weeks ago, they were facing the end of days. Undead hordes, Norscan raiders, demons of chaos, and a very uncomfortable number of Skaven. In just a matter of days, those threats had been eradicated. They were even finding new enemies. They discovered a beastman camp, hidden deep within the Dragfold, and the sound of peace rang out amid the din of 1,000 dying Gors, Ungors, and other Gors. Though the forces of evil were preparing their encore, something was stirring. Like a bloodhound on the scent, Gotrek ran alone across the Empire, still caked in beastman blood and filth, and returned to Elspeth and Felix at the gates of Nuln. What would compel him to do such a thing? The only thing that truly motivates the Slayer. The promise of a glorious doom. Somehow, an army of the vilest abominations, backed up by the Dawi-Jah, the Chaos Dwarves, had managed to slip undetected across the Empire, right up to Elspeth's seat of power. Led by the Maggot Lord Temakar, they were hell-bent on turning Nuln into a disease-ridden pile of rubble for reasons Elspeth was not quite clear on, but such were the ways of chaos. They show up unannounced and ruin everything. From the Chaos Wastes came a who's who of vile and pestilent beings reinforced by the deranged creations of the Dawi-Jah. Siege engines of malignant growths and rotting flesh rumbled forwards, seemingly absorbing and enveloping every shot from the handgunners. But by now, Elspeth had learned that there was no problem that could not be fixed with more gunpowder. The rocket batteries sizzled to life and unloaded volley after volley on the encroaching Chaos worshippers. Elspeth was not alone in her stand. Malachi Macaison, part-time slayer, part-time teacher at the engineering college, and full-time lunatic, had brought some of his wildest creations and zealous doom-seekers to defend the city. The dwarves were bristling on the walls, eager to settle ancient grudges against their infernal kin. At the forefront of this defense were our heroes, Gotrek and Felix. I'm sure they were here a second ago. Ah, there we go. Yes, they had somehow managed to fall off the walls and face the mass of chaos on the floor. Felix claims he was pushed. Gotrek says a wizard did it. As the forces of evil surged towards the wall, the two of them clashed with the biggest foes they could, and the din of battle ran out everywhere, undercut by the booming, earth-shaking footsteps of something approaching. Something big. Lumbering towards the gates of Nuln came Temakar, atop his gargantuan toad dragon. The two of them hammered at the gate. Gunners on the walls panicked at the nightmare unfolding beneath them, but salvation swept in, and Elspeth crashed down to meet him. The two towering personalities clashed, warlord versus magistrates, the forces of decay colliding against those of death. The dragons snapped and lunged for each other, and the pressure in the air rose and dropped as the city's defender let forth surges of pure amethyst energy. The smell that rose to the walls was sickening. Charred, burnt, diseased meat, and the unmistakable waft of ozone. Despite the furious onslaught of the champion of Nurgle, Elspeth was unwavering. She displayed no hesitation, exertion, or emotion, and as Temakar toppled, and a sickening surge of maggots emerged from his bloated corpse, she showed no shred of anything. She tugged the reins of her carmine dragon and soared. There's a lot of things to be unsettled about by the Dark Lady of Nuln. Her fragrant and reckless use of forbidden magic, her complete disregard for controlled firepower, her awful habit of appearing in graveyards, whether she felt remorse at the death of her troops by her own hand or her enemy. None can say, for she never displayed the slightest flicker of emotion. It strikes unease into the rank and file, but you cannot deny the results. It was she that propped up the Empire, she that defeated the evils that threatened their borders, and she that came to the aid of Karl Franz and prevented Altdorf's certain doom. Without her, mankind would have fallen. But she wants no parades, no praise, no recognition. Elspeth remains scorned by the people of Nuln and beyond. They call her a witch and a heretic, but she doesn't care. She returned to her tower, waiting till next she's needed, not for the glory, not for the gain, and not for her allegiance to the Emperor. She does it because it's her duty. And that was my narrative campaign for Elspeth von Draken. If you've managed to stick it out till now, well done. This one went a bit overboard, and I promise you they aren't usually this long. But good for you for getting stuck in. My name's Willis, and this channel is my way to explore the stories that come from some of my favourite games. The aim is to take a full campaign, squash it down, get some nice fancy shots, and then use it all to tell a story. I'm starting with Warhammer 3, because it's a perfect fit, though I'll be looking to take on some other games soon. If you've any suggestions, I would love to hear them in the comments. Likewise, any fans of Elspeth and her campaign, let me hear from you. I'm going to let you in on a secret. I prefer her to Karl Franz. I don't know, just the gothic horror intro into an unwilling saviour who solves every problem with indiscriminate firepower. Ooh, it makes me giddy. I'll be coming out with these campaigns on the regular, and I'm always eager to hear suggestions for other lords and factions to add to my shortlist. If you want to know what's coming next, well, let me say they've made an appearance in this video, even if it were a short one. Speculate away if you want, or just ask and I'll tell you, I don't mind. Either way, subscribe to the channel if you want to stay in the loop, and I will catch you another day for another story.